It's a good time to be doing a review of the ADF's force posture. It's over 20 years since the last one of the late 1980s, early 90s. And that one saw a string of air bases constructed across the north of Australia, and it moved about a third of the army to Darwin. That was in response to the world as it was then. But this is now, and it's time to have another look at what the external world looks like and what impact that might have on ADF operations. In contemplating a move of the ADF, there's a number of factors that have to be taken into account. First, and probably foremost, is where the ADF is likely to be called upon to operate. Mounting operations locally is generally easier than trying to do them from a distance. There's also an argument to be made that having the ADF located in reasonably distant parts of the country is a way of asserting our sovereignty there. But I think that's a view of the world that's probably a little bit dated these days. Having a military presence to assert sovereignty is really a bit of a throwback to 20th century thinking, I think. Any ADF base, of course, has a significant local impact, and that there are positives and negatives about that. The positive impacts are economic. ADF bases bring a lot of business with them. Local contractors do well, local storekeepers do well. There's basically an influx of money into the local community. The downside is that it can be quite disruptive to community structures. You have a large influx of mostly men, or about 70% men in the case of most ADF units, with relatively high incomes, and that's not always welcomed by the locals. Geography and environment plays a role as well. There are places where it's amenable to military operations, and there are places that aren't. To give an example of that, the tidal range is important when considering establishing a naval base. The two main naval bases we have at the moment in Sydney and Fremantle have tidal ranges between about 1 and 2 metres, which is perfectly manageable. But in parts of northwestern Australia, the tidal range can be as much as 10 metres, which makes it very difficult in terms of trying to berth major ships. There's also an opportunity cost of the land. If you have an ADF base on the land, you can't do anything else with it. Considerations of where to put the ADF ultimately has to come down to the ability of the forces to protect Australia's interests, to conduct operations and to provide military presence and power where appropriate. We have a Navy that operates in at least 2 oceans, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and at the moment we have 2 bases from which they do that, one on the east coast and one on the west coast. We have northern bases for the RAAF and the Army, and they were constructed about 20 years ago, but they weren't cheap. The Army presence in the north cost about $1 billion to establish and costs about $13,000 per soldier per year to maintain there, compared to having them closer to major population centres in southeastern Australia. The Air Force bases in the north cost about $1 billion, and there was a time back in the 1980s when they were seriously considering moving the Navy from Sydney Harbour to Jervis Bay, and the cost of that move would have been about $2 billion. So these things don't come cheaply. If we look at the changes to the world since the last force posture review, generally speaking, the South Pacific has got a bit worse. The instability in South Pacific nations has increased, the demographic trends are working against a nice stable order out there, and the odds are good that the ADF will be called upon to operate out there again, like they have in Bougainville and the Solomon Islands in the last 10 or 15 years. Southeast Asia, generally speaking, is in better shape than it was in 1990. Economic growth has seen millions of people lifted out of poverty, and as a result, internal stability has improved, and Southeast Asia, on the whole, is a more stable and more manageable place than it was then. In terms of the far picture, the Indian and Pacific Oceans are more contested spaces than they were. The rise of India and China has seen more great power rivalry, and navies, the US Navy, the Indian Navy, the Chinese Navy are starting to bump up against one another in those spaces. There's a distinct possibility that the ADF will also be called upon to do a bit more in those areas. But one of the most significant changes, and we know that the review is looking at this pretty seriously, is the growth in the energy and resources sector in the northwest and north of Australia. Billions of export dollars are generated out of those areas each year, and the ADF presence there at the moment is pretty thin. But when we analyse what the appropriate response to that is, it's actually hard to work out what the threat is that the ADF would have to respond to. So we can talk in generalities in the absence of specific threats. And generally speaking, the ADF could be called upon to do one of two things. Respond to incidents out there, in which case you need to be able to respond quickly and you need a fairly agile presence. Or the ADF could be called upon in times of tension to have a sustained presence out there as a deterrent, if you like. And that you can do from a little bit further away. In terms of response operations, you might be looking at things like aircraft or patrol boats that can get out there quickly, provide a military response, maybe search and rescue, maybe apply some firepower if required, those sorts of things. So there might be an argument for a limited ADF presence in that area, those rapid response assets. In terms of a sustained presence though, maritime patrol either by surface vessels or perhaps by long-range aircraft, they can be mounted from further afield in any case. And given that ultimately the ADF doesn't operate its own economy, it's more efficient to have it near major population centres where you get economies of scale. The conclusion you come to when you unpack all of those issues is that at the moment there doesn't seem to be any compelling reason for a major shift of ADF force posture. The ADF is where it is for a variety of reasons, some historical, some past the test of efficiency, but moves are expensive. Any moves that we do now would have to be for very good reasons, and it's not clear that those reasons are there.